Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Dorset Council's Overview and Scrutiny Committee for Resources. What we'll do is we'll get straight into the meeting because we have a lot of stuff to discuss this afternoon. So, first of all, we have received apologies from Councillor Andy Canning, and we have received an apology from Councillor Darrell Turner, although his plans have changed and he's managed to join us. Just throw a curveball in there. Is everyone happy that the apologies are accepted? Could I have a murmuring in favour or against?
Yeah.
Happy with that.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any declarations of interest they wish to bring to the committee's attention at this time? Okay, yeah. If anything comes to mind during the meeting, please feel free to flag it up then. Is everybody happy that the minutes of the meeting of the 2nd of June are a true and accurate record of that meeting?
Yeah, yes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Yes, Chairman.
Sorry to interrupt. Does anyone have any amendments to those they would like to propose?
No.
No, excellent. Therefore, can I assume everyone is in favour? If you are against, could you please indicate now? Excellent. We will take that as in favour, and I will sign those when we can next get into the office when the new normal sets in. Moving on to public participation, we have a question that has been submitted by Sarah Canny. I'd like to pass over to our committee clerk, Helen, to read that question on Sarah's behalf. Helen.
There are two parts to this question. The first part is, we understand that £700,000 was spent on the hire of hotel beds to enable discharge of vulnerable patients from acute hospitals. Is it possible to know how many people in total were accommodated in the hotel rooms? And the second part is it possible to explain how and by whom the decision was made to hire these rooms?
Spencer, we spoke earlier. I know you'd like to make a quick observation and then the response as well from Helen. Over to you, Spencer Flowers, Leader of the Council.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Just very quickly, really, because Helen's read the question out, and it's familiar to me because we've answered the question on a similar question on two previous occasions. I think the sensible thing to do is to rely on the answers previously given, and I know Helen's got those answers that we prepared and used in two previous cabinet meetings. So I suggest you hand over to Helen to read out the response, Chairman.
Helen.
Okay, the leader did make it clear that one-off funding could not be used to reopen closed community hospitals and beds to change the outcomes of the clinical services review. He made this point because there are some people who still do not accept the final decision made by the Secretary of State on the clinical services review, and who argue that COVID funding made available to the Council should have been used to reopen community hospitals on a continuing basis. It was right that the leader should be very clear about this important point. The aim of the hotel accommodation was to provide temporary accommodation for individuals who were medically able to be discharged from hospital and were awaiting further social care support to be arranged at home. A hospital setting was not considered due to the anticipated needs of the individuals being discharged, not requiring a ward environment which may cause increased dependency, but instead to have an environment with similar facilities to home in order to maximise their independence. The decision to make these arrangements was made by Dorset Council senior officers in consultation with the Cabinet Lead for Adult Social Care and Dorset Clinical Commissioning Group. Other options were considered, e.g. care homes, however, none were available that could accommodate the anticipated numbers at the time. Fortunately for Dorset, the anticipated demand was not realised and only 3 individuals required accommodation. The Council will consider all of the lessons learned through the COVID-19 outbreak when looking at any future actions required should there be any further outbreak scenarios. That's the response.
Okay. Thank you very much. And can we ensure that a copy of that makes it to Sarah, because the public's participation is always greatly valued. Moving on to the one of the two main items for today. Can I ask committee members on their first appearance on the screen to introduce themselves by name, so that members of the public watching know who they are. So I will therefore hand over to Matt Crotter, the Chief Executive, and Spencer Flowers, the Leader of the Council, to introduce a brief synopsis of their report, and then we'll get straight into committee questions. Matt.
Chairman, thank you very much. I think Spencer is going to do the introductions, and I'm going to share my screen, which have got some updated visuals on some of the issues that we've been supporting as Dorset Council. So while I'll share that, Spencer will introduce the report.
Okay, Chairman. Okay, Chairman.
Yes, please go ahead, Spencer.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, thank you for inviting us today to the committee to give a little bit of a background to our response to COVID. And there is a fairly short introduction report to your committee today, underpinned by the report that went to Cabinet, which is far more comprehensive. And you'll be pleased to know I don't intend to read through all of that this afternoon, but I wanted just to really highlight a couple of things. And Matt's put a very useful couple of slides up, or will do, around the actual scale of what the council's had to deal with during this crisis period. And it's quite astonishing when you actually step back and look at what we've done in a relatively short time. It's absolutely incredible. And I've said it many times, and I will say it again, and I'll go on to what the report talks about. The immense support from all the officers and members of the council has been tremendous. I mean, what we've done is, if without a crisis, I suspect we'd have taken a lot longer to get some of the learning that we hope we've got now into our thinking in Dorset Council, and we'll take that forward in the future. But if I do a quick summary, Chairman, I mean, you've got this report today because Cabinet felt it was absolutely appropriate that Scrutiny have a look at our response to COVID. It's the second time your committee's done that, and we were very grateful for the work you did last time, and I'm sure we'll be as equally as grateful this time round. Some really good questions, some good tests around did we get it right, and I think broadly we probably did. Could we do things a bit different? Probably, with a bit more time. We have an awful lot of stuff going on where we had to make decisions on our feet, so I think we did immensely well to do that. I'm not going to dwell too long on this, because I'm going to assume that colleagues around the table, virtually at least, have had a chance to read this report, and me reading it again isn't going to add any great value to that. But just on a couple of things, on the financial implications, which is something that's going to roll on for a little while yet before we finally, hopefully, get something sorted that's deliverable as a council. We've still got issues around a gap between the budget that we set last year and this year, and what the likely impact of COVID is going to bring. And that's probably a topic for another day in more detail. But I didn't want anybody to believe that everything was all right and everything was all right on the night and the problem had gone away. It hasn't. And we've got a lot of work to do collectively as councillors in dealing with that. We have had more money from government, and that's really, really helpful. But we really do need more, and we need more action on our part to try and do what we can. And I know that on the 28th of July, Tony Ferrari asked some specific questions around the issues on finance, and we'll see where we go with that. Clearly, there's a climate change implication on all of this, and something that we've, as a standing item on these reports, we don't lose sight of that. And we'll deal with that in another place. But I think I've probably not going to say much more, other than to just point out, that, Chairman, that as it says in the report and a more recent update, and we haven't had any deaths, thankfully, in Dorset for some time now, and we've got very few cases, most of which are not acute, from what I understand. There aren't any in Dorchester Hospital, so that's good news for Dorset, and it demonstrates yet again how well we've done within our own area in dealing with the COVID crisis. It's compared to, we are one of the best, one of the lowest infected and lowest death areas in the country, and that's great credit to everybody that's been involved, including the public. And the public have really respected the need to distance and wear masks when they go in shops and to behave in an appropriate way. And I think we should give them great credit for that as well. So I think as an opening shot, Chairman, I won't say any more, and perhaps you'd like to pass over to Matt Prosser.
Chairman, thank you. I wasn't going to add a huge amount more. Just a quick reminder for members. It feels slightly strange to remember that we are still in a declared major incident. That has not changed at all, and we still operate in that environment. Despite the easing of lockdown, it's perhaps more challenging going through an easing than it is going into a lockdown in one sense, because there are many in our community who are still feeling the impact, who are still feeling vulnerable or concerned about going out or contracting COVID-19, whereas there are others who have also moved on and are starting to enjoy life under eased of lockdown, and that's no different for colleagues across the council. So as a council, we're trying to reshape how we're operating. Some of that's longer term, and as the report sets out, and certainly in some of the responses, I'm sure we can cover off some of that as we move back to whatever that much used phrase now is, new normal. The new normal for us is that I've still got 2,500 colleagues working from their homes as a result of the pandemic. That new normal means I've also got colleagues who are working with appropriate personal protective equipment, or with social distancing measures in place. For the few staff that we have operating out of offices for the services they deliver, they're working in a COVID secure environment. So things are not back to normal in that stage, and we're continuing to deal with that. But the day-to-day impact of COVID is less in the southwest than it is in many areas. And as Spencer has quite rightly highlighted, I'm grateful to the public for their contribution towards that in terms of good health and hygiene standards and listening to advice as it's given out in the main from the national messages from Public Health England and from the government. I'll stop there and I'm happy to answer any questions, Chair.
Thank you. What I'd like to suggest is that we go down the list of committee members, and the first on my list is the Vice Chairman, Councillor Mike Parks.
I know there's some other questions coming up about this, Chairman, but I just really want to touch on the housing of homeless people, and why was Weymouth the only place that was chosen where there's clearly homeless people elsewhere across the Dorset area?
So, Chair, if you want me to answer that one in generality. So, Councillor Parks, of course, Weymouth wasn't the only place where homeless houses were housed. It was the area where the largest number were housed, but we have homeless accommodation across the county. And at the homelessness session in July, the numbers were given as to where those were being housed, and that includes areas across Portland, Swanage, across to the eastern side of Dorset. I can't remember the exact locations. But one of the issues for a number of our people who are finding themselves in need of temporary accommodation and homeless accommodation is that they have complex needs, and therefore in order to meet the requirements of their complex needs, they need support agencies to wrap around them, not just provided by Dorset Council but by others, either by health organisations or charitable organisations, and a number of those are cited and centred around Weymouth. That's a short-term issue. It's not a long-term position that we want to be in, and there'll be more about that coming forward in the near future through Councillor Graham Carr-Jones and the housing portfolio.
Mike, do you have any other questions?
No, thank you. That was it. Thank you.
OK, I will then pass over to Councillor Beryl Ezard.
Good afternoon. No, I've got no comment. I'm very happy with how things have gone in the Wareham area. I think we've, the community and the Wareham Town Council and the local councillors have done a grand job in following up and really following everything that's gone on at Dorset Council. And I do thank you all very much.
Thank you, Councillor Ezard. I'm sure your thanks are echoed by every member of this committee. Next will be Councillor Barry Gorringe.
Thank you, Chairman. Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Yeah, it's Councillor Barry Gorringe, St Leonard's and St Ives. I've just picked up one point in the report on page 37, with regard to point 9.83, which is to do with the council got a grant of 1.3 million for test and trace. Now, it was my understanding that the NHS was doing the test and trace. Can somebody explain what that 1.3 million is for?
Yes, Chair, I'm happy to have a go at that, although my Director of Public Health, Sam Crowe, could give you more detailed response to it. But ostensibly, our role as a public health authority, so we provide the public health service across the Dorset Council area and across Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole through a shared Director of Public Health. That's our connectivity into it. So if you look into the detail of the report, you'll see that the test and trace process works on three tiers. And at a certain level, working with Public Health England and the regional public health team, Dorset Council public health officers support the test and trace procedure. Now, nationally, there's been comments about that, about how effective the test and trace procedure has been, and actually, where it's been the most effective is where it's worked with the local teams on the ground more quickly. And this week, I've received notification, along with Sam, that we will now be receiving data within 24 hours of any localised outbreaks, in order that we can support that test and trace mechanism on a national basis. The reality being, if you happen to have a call answering service on your telephone and you see a national number ringing you, you may not want to pick it up. If you see a number that's got an 01305 code, a local code, and if you happen to recognise it's the council's number as well, you're more likely to pick that up. And so local teams who know the local areas, know the issues, know the communities, are providing support. So that's money that we've been given to support that national test and trace programme.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Any additional questions, Barry? I'll take that as a no and move on to Councillor Brian Heatley.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm Councillor Brian Heatley. I represent Rodwell and Wyke in Weymouth. Can I first of all, like everybody else, say what a tremendous achievement the council's response has been, and I'm saying that because I'm going to start doing a little bit of party pooping in a moment. Very shortly after our last resources meeting on this subject in June, the Institute for Fiscal Studies published a report on the geographical ways how different geographical areas have been affected and would be affected by COVID. And their thesis was that the vulnerability of an area depends partly on the age of the population, and that's what has the short-term effect. It's the number of people who get ill, the number of people who die, and it's a bit of a surrogate for the number of people who are otherwise vulnerable. Then in the medium term, it is the effect on the economy, and places that have economies with that depend on tourism, depend on hospitality industry, will be likely to be most vulnerable. And finally, the third part of the effect was the number of families in poverty, in particular because of the effects on the children of those families over the long term, because of the educational disadvantages they're likely to suffer. Now, they looked at all the local authorities across the country, and they found that there were 9 authorities who were in the bottom half for each of those dimensions. That is to say, how many old people, how much the economy depended on vulnerable sectors, how much they had families in poverty. And there were just 9 local authorities in that most vulnerable category, and Dorset is one of them. And Dorset is one of them in particular in some of its seaside areas, in particular because of the number of vulnerable families. Well, so what? We had, as we have heard, in a way, a very successful response to COVID, in the sense that our infection rates have been low and mercifully the number of people dying have gone down. But we remain extremely vulnerable. And in responding to any future outbreak, I think we are going to want to think carefully about the balance of our response in those 3 areas. That we are not going to want to do things that affect our tourist industry and associated industries, because we've taken a big enough hit there already. We're going to be very concerned to get our children back to school, and all the children back to school. And that means that the medical part of the response has to bear perhaps a rather greater weight in a place like Dorset than it might do elsewhere. And so that brings me to, well, where is that medical response going to come? I mean, we're probably not going to want widespread lockdowns because of the effect on our economy. And the important, probably the most important single thing we can do, and I'm a layperson, I don't fully understand these matters, although I have talked to Dr. John Orrell about it, Councillor Dr. Orrell, is the test and trace system. And I was very pleased to hear the answers about us taking greater control of that test and trace system locally. I'm wondering whether the resources are adequate. If you look at the paper, and I've lost the reference at this exact moment, but back on page 24, we were making 3 people available for this. If we did face a substantial further attack of COVID, it seems to me that we'll need rather more than that. And maybe we should be thinking about training people for that, to be ready to make this a major part of our response. Maybe we need to spend some of our own money on it as well. But it does seem to me, as for all the reasons Matt suggested, this should become our first line of defence. John Orrell asked a couple more questions, one of which was to say, look, the places that seem to have done best in responding to this pandemic are the places that have taken action quickly. We actually did quite well in Dorset, not least because the disease was relatively late reaching here compared to some other places, and the lockdown came early enough here for it to have a big effect. But what is it that's going to trigger us into really beginning to take serious action again? And in particular, if we do feel we have to begin to take serious action again, is there going to be within the health service this policy of moving a lot of people from hospital beds into care homes that caused us real problems during the first wave of COVID? Or can we reconsider that policy? Or I know it's a health service policy, but we are very much parties to it. Is there a way we can avoid that? Is there some modification of that we can do so that we don't get a recurrence of the whole range of problems we got when we moved people from hospitals into care homes? I know I'm sorry to be so gloomy when the basic story is we responded really well the first time round, but I don't think we should be at all complacent about there not being a second time round, and I think we should have some recognition of just how vulnerable we are. Thank you.
Spencer or Matt, who would like to respond to?
Chair, I'm happy to pick up some of the threads that come through Councillor Heatley's sort of statements and questions in there, and some interesting. I'd be interested in that study. Obviously, as Councillor Heatley has highlighted, it was a theoretical study, and we have disproved one element of that in terms of age of population has not been the largest determinant for us here in Dorset. I think there are more complex issues around community transmission that there, but certainly in terms of the economy and in terms of families in poverty, we remain as a senior leadership team incredibly focused on the impact of that, particularly as you saw the slides I shared, looking at how we support particularly our vulnerable families through this summer with some a Summer in Dorset campaign, which is around giving activities to children who've been in lockdown, who've not been in formal education, helping to support, prepare them ready for going back into formal education in September. We know this is going to be a difficult area, and the team are committed to that. In terms of the numbers of people there to support localised outbreak control, you talk about there are 3 members of staff highlighted in the public health team that are mentioned in the report. You're you're absolutely right. But we also have access to the wider environmental health team, who in themselves are professionally trained to deal with outbreak control issues, particularly around usually around public health issues around food poisoning, outbreaks, food within institutions. But the reality is, for us in Dorset, if we were to see a localised outbreak, it's more likely to be in a setting such as in the hospitality sector or within a small business environment. So we do have, just to assure members, we do have more professionally qualified staff who we can call on in the time of an emergency to bolster that without having to train up people. But that is part of that 1.28 million spend from the public health team, looking to ensure we've got the right response ready so that we can move at pace. Moving on to the care homes, and again, a really helpful sort of debate around this. One of the issues that we've obviously learned from the last 6 months is around outbreak management, outbreak control, and ensuring that our care homes, who sadly perhaps didn't have the right outbreak management in place at the start, and that's a national comment, not a localized comment, because they're not equipped to deal with that. They're not always a medical setting. They're a care home. They're not a medicalised setting. But we have been working with all the care homes across Dorset to train them to be able to deal with outbreak and infection control, and that's also come with support of £5 million of the funding that we've had from government to share with the 149 care homes we have across Dorset. So give some assurance. But also to say absolutely right to raise those issues, that we're on top of it should there be a second wave. I have to say, I think if Sam Crowe were here, our Director of Public Health, he would talk about a longer tail rather than a second wave here in Dorset in particular, and we're seeing that in reality. As the lockdown is eased, as measures are eased, we've seen slight increases in numbers of people with COVID. That's also got to be balanced against the fact we're testing more, but also against, as Spencer mentioned earlier, we've not had any deaths since the middle of June, and we have no cases as of today in hospital, which indicates that these, whilst the infection is prevalent, it's at a low level impact on the population.
Can I add to that, please, Chairman? Can I add to what Matt said? We do have a local outbreak plan in place, been approved. If Sam was here, he would take you through it, I'm sure. And members will recall that we did have a members webinar on local outbreak planning only a couple of 3 weeks ago, and I'm confident actually that we're not complacent. Brian's right to say you've done well, but don't be complacent. I don't believe we are. I think we are on our toes. We've had an opportunity actually to prepare for something that we had no time to prepare for at all back in March. So I think there's a step change in our ability to deal with any outbreaks that might occur locally, because we've had the opportunity to prepare for it. We didn't have that opportunity back in March when the whole thing kicked off. So I think we're in a slightly different place, but I do understand his points. But I think overall we have done the right things, but he's right for us to make sure we stay on our toes and aren't complacent, and I know we aren't. Thank you, Chairman.
Aidan Dunn.
Thank you, Chairman. Aidan Dunn, I'm the Executive Director for Corporate Development, and I'm also the Council's lead on the Strategic Coordination Group, which is the multi-agency gathering of police, fire, ambulance, NHS. I just wanted to provide some reassurance to Brian. The multi-agency approach is still continuing, as you might hope and expect. Indeed, at lunchtime today, we had our latest get-together. You mentioned about will the NHS be prepared for the future as well? The issues that we're thinking through as we approach the autumn and then into the winter, it's the concurrency of issues, because as well as COVID, there is the concern about the usual winter flu. So there's very much a sense of the importance of the winter vaccinations, winter flu vaccinations, a sense of trying to encourage those and make sure that the health service, indeed local authority, is resilient. But also there's a concurrent issue of the UK's transition after Brexit, as well. So that issue is still live, as well as the sort of in particular around any economic impacts. So we as multi-agencies are continuing to work together to plan around those assumptions, because winter flu, transition after Brexit, and this extended tail of COVID could all happen in the future. So we're planning and working on those scenarios. Thank you.
Thank you. Brian, do you have any additional questions?
No, I don't think so. I'm considerably reassured that people are still thinking about all these things, and that we are planning for what might happen, and I hope profoundly that it does not happen. The one thing I would say is I think that one of the big lessons of the last few months is that very unexpected things happen from time to time, and with the best laid plans it may still happen, and unexpected things that are not what I've been talking about, but we know not what of. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll pass over to Sherry Jesperson next. Councillor Sherry Jesperson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have seen the localised outbreak plan. We were given a very thorough presentation on it, and I do share Councillor Spencer Flower's quiet confidence. It looks to me like a very sound plan, and I am reassured by what I've heard here this afternoon. But one of the concerns I do feel I need to raise, because it has come up quite consistently across my ward, has been around the GP response. And I know that when this was raised briefly at a previous meeting, Councillor Orrell was very quick to say how excellently GPs had done, and I'm sure in his case that is absolutely the case. But I have been getting quite a lot of feedback about the difficulty people found in accessing GP services. It is true that there were digital access put in place, and I'm not talking here only about old people who wouldn't be able to go online. I'm talking about all sorts of people, young and old, who have difficulty accessing the GP services, and that is partly why nationally we have now this very, very concerning backlog of health services and health treatment, and that this is what is reflected, of course, in the very concerning overall death figures. Now, Aidan referenced taking a multi-agency approach, and that's excellent, thank you. Could you then, while you're carrying on your multi-agency approach, share with those parts of the meetings that you attend, those people that represent the GP services, the absolute front line for people out in the community needing help with non-COVID related health matters, because I do think that there is a need for GP services in some parts of Dorset to maybe up their game a bit and respond a little better. I don't want to overstate it, but certainly that is very much the feedback that I'm getting. Thank you.
Can I suggest we pass to Aidan Dunn to start with, to take those comments on board?
Yep. Thank you, Chair. Yes, absolutely. In terms of oversight of GPs, it's the Clinical Commissioning Group, and they're part of the multi-agency approach. So we can, I can take that formally, but also I think we've got good links with the CCG, and we can take that informally. I think behind the scenes, I can have a conversation around specifics, because I think it's always helpful to have specific examples. But it's certainly something we can take up. Yes.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Chair, could I also suggest? Chair, yes, thank you. Could I also perhaps suggest that this might be a topic of consideration to pass to our own health scrutiny as well, who obviously work with our multi-agency partner, but in particular this question with the health element, and can raise that directly with the CCG as well. So a two-pronged approach would be probably beneficial.
That would be very helpful. Thank you very much indeed.
And the chairman of that fantastic committee, Councillor Jill Haynes, is with us this afternoon, and I'm sure she will have taken that on board. She's not indicating that she wishes to make comments at the moment, but I'm sure that has been noted in the notepad. Therefore, Sherry, unless you have any additional questions.
No, that's me.
No?
Thank you for
Okay.
now. Thank you.
Then Councillor Howard Legg has indicated that he doesn't have any questions at this time. Councillor Julie Robinson doesn't seem to be with us this afternoon, unfortunately, so therefore I will pass to Councillor David Shortall.
Thank you, Chairman. Most of the questions I've prepared actually has been covered, particularly in respect to the GP practices. A lot of inquiries I've had is regarding the restoration of our standard appointments for general ailments, and of course child immunisation, and whether that will be up and running very shortly, and screen testing for in particular ladies. And I just want assurance that in fact, you know, that the CCG will be tackled in restoring the responses of the GP practices. Saying that, though, I think the council has done an excellent support, and I think everyone I spoke to are full of admiration for Dorset Council, and I've often said that it's a pity that national government hadn't followed our lead. So I'll hand that back to you, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. For members of the public watching, we have invited the chairman of the 4 other scrutiny committees to join us today. They aren't voting members, but their contributions are just as valuable. So therefore, I'd like to hand over to Councillor Matt Hall, who is the chair of the Ordnance and Governance Committee. Matt Hall.
Thank you very much, Piers. It's a slightly crystal ball question for perhaps Matt Prosser, Aidan Dunn, etc. But with all the fears of a second spike, or the long tail as it was referred to earlier, how financially prepared for this coming winter is Dorset Council? Thank you.
Chair, I'm just getting my crystal ball out. That's a really interesting question. Obviously, within the report that went to Cabinet, there was a comment about our financial position, and obviously we continue to update that. Like many things at this time, there is a degree of a huge degree of uncertainty. An uncertainty of both the impact on our finances directly in terms of both the income that we generate and also the expenditure that we incur, but also the support that would be given to us as a council. So in the report, it sets out the money that we've had directly from government as unring-fenced grants, and no doubt Aidan could talk directly about that. We're also waiting, obviously, for the outcome of the detailed guidance on the income protection scheme, which the government has put in place. None of that will cover all of the increased costs, stroke loss of income that we've incurred during this period. So moving towards the winter, we're obviously looking at the winter pressures, looking at the potential demand that could have on the service, although perhaps perversely some of the demand that will be created on the service, certainly winter pressures within the adult social care market, have already sadly been impacted by COVID directly, if you understand what I'm saying. So we're prepared as a service for delivery. In terms of our financial robustness, that will depend on the circumstances that we are facing and whether we gain any further support from government. At the moment, the only further support that we're expecting directly is within the spending review, which is being mooted for the autumn. We have no further details on that unless Aidan's had something in the last 24 hours. But I'll see if Aidan wants to make a comment about the finance issues.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, it's I wish I did have a crystal ball. I'd make a couple of comments, and just to bring the committee and other viewers up to speed. So the paper we've got in front of us went to Cabinet on the 30th of June and talked about a level of overspend, and then subsequently we've had a Q1 finance paper that went to Cabinet on the 28th of July that talked about a 43 million overspend for this financial year. And since then, as indicated in the covering report, we've got a little bit more government funding, and we're waiting to hear about the income that we'll receive from government. So our assessment is, if there was no further outbreak of COVID, we think the overspend will be in the mid-30s. That's the latest position that we've got, and that's about additional funding coming from government. So that's for this financial year. And what we've been very clear about is that we're having to use our reserves to underpin that position, and we're in the fortunate position that we have at this point sufficient reserves to cover that. But Councillor Hall makes a very, very clear point. As if a further spike or further activity were to come, then it's going to be a further draw on resources, and those reserves we can only spend once. So what we are doing as a sort of finance team and as a senior leadership team, we're starting to model different financial scenarios of what the rest of this year could look like, and indeed what next year's financial position could look like as well. So we need to be prepared, and this is happening all over the country as well. So we're looking at those scenarios, getting as prepared as we can be, but ultimately, as we've seen from this year, the 20+ million that we've received from government, we would be reliant on additional government funding. That's the very reality of the situation that we're in. So yeah, either way, difficult times ahead.
Okay, any other questions, Matt?
No, that's it. Thank you, Piers.
Okay, then I will pass over to Councillor Jill Haynes, who is the chairman of the Health Scrutiny Committee.
Thank you very much, Piers. I really only have one area I'd like to explore. We have relied very heavily throughout the COVID outbreak on information and advice from public health. And the news today, or yesterday, regarding the disbanding of public health, I wondered if any officers had had any further information, because I could see this having a considerable knock-on effect to activity at the council. I imagine that part of the duties of public health will be handed down to councils, and I just wondered if we could have any further information on that, if anybody has any, because I'm very concerned that that they are heading up our response to COVID in Dorset, and yet having their powers taken away.
Chair.
Matt Prosser.
Chair, I'm happy to take that and respond, and I'll take my response directly from an email that I received from Sam Crowe, our Shared Director of Public Health. First of all, on a simple headline, of course, the distinction is between Public Health England, who is the national body, and Dorset Public Health Team, and they're not connected in that sense. So the Public Health Team in Dorset are not affected by the changes directly at a national level. So if I read this, I'll read this response from Sam. It says, I'm sure you've all seen the coverage of the announcement that Public Health England is going to be replaced by a new National Institute for Health Protection that will combine the NHS Test and Trace, Public Health England and the Joint Biosecurity Centre. He was in a call that afternoon with the regional directors of public health and the other directors of public health from across the southwest, and just wanted to share what it might mean for local outbreak planning and response work. The key message that he took away is that despite these apparently unsettling changes, the ongoing health protection work that the regional health protection team has been undertaking, working closely with councils, will continue. The Southwest team is very focused on the job to be done and the challenge of preparing for winter, and will continue to do everything to ensure that disruption is as minimal as possible. They are being incredibly professional in the face of the sudden news and keen to ensure that as far as possible it will be business as usual. They're still to continue to recruit, for example, to build additional capacity to support the pandemic response, which is reassuring. Further detail will come out about the exact functions that will be delivered by the new organisation, and questions perhaps remain over whether Public Health England's work on health and wellbeing and health improvement will be part of the new institute, for example. The priority over the next few weeks is to ensure we can influence the shape of the integration between Test and Trace and the new institute, and ensure we have a local model that works for us. The current consensus in the Southwest amongst directors of public health is we would not want to duplicate what is working well, with the regional health protection team continuing to lead on statutory health protection work, supported by councils through local outbreak plans where necessary. As more details become available, I'll keep you posted. But he thought he'd give early assurance that what he's been given through the regional team they remain committed to supporting us as they go through this change. So I think it's early days in terms of the national headline of change, but we'll keep members updated on what impact that will have on a local level. But at this stage, I'm suggesting it's no change, and the teams will continue to work at a local level very well together.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. That gives us a certain amount of assurance. Obviously, we need to know about the fine detail, don't we? But at least that's some reassurance that there will be continuity.
Thank you. Councillor Darrell Turner, who is the chairman of the Place Scrutiny Committee.
Chairman, thank you. I've got nothing to add.
Okay, thank you. It won't surprise the committee, Spencer or Matt, that I have a few questions, but I'd like to start with something which I don't do enough on this committee, and I'd actually like to start with some really positive feedback. And I know that Councillor Ray Bryan and John Selgrim are with us this afternoon, and it relates to the Highways team, and in my mind, the absolutely fantastic job that they have done, especially since about mid-May, particularly when it became very evident the work that they were doing as lockdown started to ease, and their attitude, that sort of can-do, let's get the job done, and working under incredible strain without possibly the parameters and guidance that they normally have within that department, and how they've really flourished to meet the challenge that easing the lockdown has presented. And I really want to take that opportunity just to recognise their fantastic work to their department head and their portfolio holder, and please pass my thanks down to them. My first question is to Matt and to Spencer, and it's about a little bit looking into the future, about very rightly so, in line with government guidance, we took the decision to move 2,500 of our employees to working at home, and you know, we have put support packages in place where we've been providing them with equipment so that they can better meet the challenges of working from home. And I was wondering if you could outline what your vision was for trying to get people to come back into the office, and when you hope to look to try and do that in some stages, because my understanding is that County Hall and Southwarks House and a lot of the other office spaces are still ghost towns.
Chair, I'm certainly happy to start the answer to that. But so ostensibly, as you've quite rightly highlighted, along with the many things that we're given guidance by government, was in order to say that if you can work from home, you should do, in order to minimise the risk of transmission, community transmission of the COVID virus. And what we have said to colleagues, as you've quite rightly said, 2,500 colleagues working at home as a result of the pandemic, and it's important to make that distinction. We've not got people working from home; they're not home workers; they are people working at home as a result of the global pandemic. And we've said to all staff at this stage, in order that they can plan, that we will not change our position on that until at least the end of September. So what we've been doing is working with colleagues alongside to, first of all, as you've said, Chair, quite rightly, making sure they've got access to the right equipment, so that when they are working at home, either sat at a kitchen table or sat at, if they've got, fortunate like me, got a desk, they've got the right chair, they've got the right monitor, keyboard, so that they're looked after in that sense. But we've also been talking about what impact it's had on staff individually. So what have they found in terms of the impact on their working environment by working at home? And the results of that survey are coming in over the next week to 10 days, and the senior leadership team and the corporate leadership team are going to be looking at that early in September to get the feedback from our colleagues and to marry that up against whatever the latest data is about transmission. So we've had various messages and have been slightly counteracted. So we've had the messages headline sort of nationally, try and get people back into offices versus the public health messages that have been saying, actually, if you can work at home, continue to do so. I think September, if I can, looking into the future, is going to be quite a pivotal month. So for many of my workforce who've been working at home whilst also having caring responsibilities and particularly homeschooling, September will be the first month where they potentially are working at home and not having the responsibility of homeschooling. And can I just pay some tremendous respect to my colleagues who've worked full-time hours and managed homeschooling arrangements for their children. We have allowed employees to be flexible with the hours that they work, and they have respected that, and I think paid that back and some to Dorset by working flexibly around the needs of childcare or healthcare arrangements. So September, as I say, is an important month, but also it represents a time when children are going back into school, and there are not necessarily statistical studies, but there are thoughts around the fact that if there are increased transmission rates, that will occur when there are more people back into localised environments like school settings, and therefore actually ensuring that our staff have the ability to work from home and not necessarily come into action with other people who've got school-aged children could be quite important. So that's why September is a really incredible important month. Going forward longer term, as a council, we're always looking at, having been 6 councils coming into one, we'd always been looking at our physical estate, the office estate. You know, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out that having been 6 organisations and having done the work we did to converge the services in pre-year 1 and year 1, we don't need as much office accommodation as we did before we became Dorset Council. If you then marry on top of that the impact on our working conditions of the global pandemic, and certainly for me, you know, I haven't been to London now for 7 months and I'm not missing it, but I've spoken at many national conferences without moving from this chair, very often leaving one meeting and literally moving across to a different screen here to take part. And there are huge benefits for me in terms of my travel footprint, huge benefits for me in terms of my time. A day in meetings in London for me incurs 7 hours worth of travel as well. So it's a day plus a day of travel. So it is a challenging piece. So going forwards, we're mindful of the impact that some of this can have on colleagues working at home, because we've all got different circumstances. Some of us may have family around us, some of us may have nobody around us, and therefore we've made sure we've sought to put the right support around our employees depending on their circumstances. So going forwards, yes, the offices are, with the right expression, ghost town, very quiet, but that is something we're mindful about and we'll be reviewing in September. In short term, that's our response to the pandemic. Longer term, what model do we want to operate on as a local authority when we're either permanently living with this, or perhaps hopefully we're in a post-COVID world?
And I'll have a follow-up question, but Councillor Peter Wharf, who is leading the EAP on reset and recovery for the Dorset Council, would like to speak. Peter.
Thank you, Councillor. So you've introduced me in terms of Councillor Peter Wharf, Corporate Development and Change, but I also have a responsibility for HR. And thank you, Matt, you're absolutely right. There will also be some significant member input into this. It is too early to make decisions. What I have done is I have had significant conversations with David McIntosh, who is the Corporate Director for HR. I visited the office 2.5 weeks ago in order to look at the measures that have been taken. And I spoke, obviously suitably socially distanced, with a number of people. And I had quite a long conversation with David McIntosh about our plans for the future. It's too early to say, but there are 2 or 3 factors that you might like to just reflect on. The first is that some people were very keen to get back to the offices, either because their home wasn't appropriate for work or for other personal reasons, and there were a small number of people who were in the offices, bearing in mind that they'd been taped off in order to facilitate for social distancing, which meant the capability of the capacity of the offices is much reduced. I've also talked to a number of employees who've worked at home and are very, very happy working at home. There are a number of other rather more nuanced issues about seating and various other things and how we do it. The one thing we need to do is we need to make sure that we don't automatically return to the old normal, because it's very clear that some people do want to work from home, some don't, some want to work for part of the time, some don't, some want to have a degree of certainty about where they are and what they're doing. So it's too early to tell yet, but we are going to ensure that we have proper consultation with staff to make sure that we achieve what we want to achieve. And certainly the Recovery and Reset EAP, we're quite clear that we must, if we can, reduce the footprint we occupy in terms of buildings and use this opportunity to use less space, whilst making sure that people don't feel that they are in any way disadvantaged. So the answer to the question is too early to say. And whilst Matt is quite correct, September, I think it will be a very slow process and we will have to tread carefully, but we will also try to ensure that we do not return to the old normal as a matter of course, whilst making sure we take everybody's requirements plus ours into account. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Matt, picking up on one of the comments you used was around wraparound support for our staff. And I was just wondering what provision you've managed to put in place, particularly around mental health for individuals during this time, both as a direct sort of response in terms of anxiety to the current situation, but also the effects that for some of our staff who are now have had the amount of social interaction in their lives drastically reduced by working from home.
Yeah, thank you, Piers. That's Chairman. That's really, really helpful. And I've got some notes in front of me, and actually one of the paragraphs is headed up. Clearly, I am very interested in the mental health and well-being of my employees. It's almost though you read the notes I prepared for today. I'm working for long periods of time at a home environment, you know, where some of them are dealing with perhaps difficult social care cases, for example, emotionally challenging circumstances can have an impact. So we've done plenty of direct actions. First of all, we've got a wellbeing offer and support. So that's both in terms of ensuring that colleagues have got access to people to talk to. So we've got an offer through our wellbeing service called Breathing Space, and that's an opportunity for people just to have a phone call with a colleague, just literally to talk about anything. Second issue is within the leadership forum, which I regularly speak to, which is our top managers across the organisation, encouraging them to have conversations with all of their colleagues for the sake of having a conversation. You know, sometimes, you know, how do you recreate what we did in the real world in the virtual world? So, for example, if I was in my office in County Hall and popped to the kitchen, I would see a number of people there who were also making a cup of tea. I'd ask them how they were, pick up on conversations about, you know, their health and well-being, their family. And just making sure we replicate that in the virtual world is just as important. So encouraging managers and colleagues to have a coffee video conference call for the sake of having a coffee together is actually really, really important. As I said in my earlier response, I think the organisation has paid that back to us. Both in terms of the way they've gone above and beyond during the period, and in terms of their output at this time. So those are some of the direct responses we've given to those, and we've obviously also got the physical aspects of our health, and we've been supported through our Dorset Live Well Dorset team, giving ideas and opportunities and challenges to team members to look after their physical health as well. Remember back to the days when you could only do 1 hour's physical exercise a day? I certainly saw that. I took that as a challenge, actually, to make sure that I took an hour's physical exercise every day. But for some people, you know, it needed a bit more support and preparation for that. And we've also sought to do that and to give good ideas to our colleagues to make sure they look after their physical as well as their mental health, because I think those two things go hand in hand.
Thank you, Matt. I gave you advance notice of the next question, which is what has the effect on productivity been across the organisation, and are there any teams that are either doing better or are not as poorly as possibly some other departments?
So Chair, thank you. You did give me this question in advance, but I have to say it's quite a difficult question necessarily to answer on more than a kind of a global anecdotal sense. So, you know, you talked about what's the percentage drop or increase in productivity during the new normal of most staff working from home. So for those listening in from outside of the committee, on an anecdotal basis, I would say that actually the impact of working from home has been mainly positive. Mainly positive in terms of the individual's productivity and the way they're delivering. So that's a global comment. You know, we've got, excluding education, we've got around 5,000 plus colleagues delivering services, of whom 2,500 are currently having to work from home because of the global pandemic. The other half are working either with appropriate PPE or social distancing. So within both numbers, there will be those who are delivering services in a hybrid model as well. So it's a complex piece. So as a headline, I would say that for most people working from home, it's not directly impacted on their productivity after the first few weeks of getting to grips with the use of technology. And then later on, as you've heard, obviously, we've distributed chairs, desks, monitors to support them in perhaps more appropriate working conditions and sat at a kitchen table for 8 hours a day. However, the simple act of working at home is not the single issue that will determine an impact directly on productivity. We're also a young organisation. At the start of the lockdown, we were only 10, 11 months old, and we were still finalising the outcome of convergence in place and corporate services, the blueprint for change in children's services, which has carried on throughout lockdown, and other one-off service transformations going on, such as in the planning team. So on top of the distractions of convergence, new management structures coming on stream, new technology either in place or teams still working with the complications of merging the previous systems of the 6 predecessor councils, we also had the pandemic. I should add that also, as I mentioned earlier, we've got some of my colleagues, many of my colleagues will have had and still have caring responsibilities, homeschooling challenges, multiple businesses operating on home broadband challenges. I found it quite pleasant to talk to a number of my colleagues' children as they've interrupted meetings and conversations. It's been a nice reality check. For me, it's just the faithful hound who is sat to my right-hand side, who fortunately hasn't snored this afternoon during the committee meeting, but occasionally she has interrupted. So I've looked at some proxy measures because measuring productivity in many of the services we offer is not the same as perhaps, for example, in a business. You know, how do you measure the productivity, say, of a social worker, for example? And if we had long-running metrics available in some areas where productivity is more easily comparable, say number of transactions carried out, we'd be able to do comparisons. But even then, we've got some complicated factors. We're only just starting to gather some of those metrics for performance reporting as a new organisation because we were 6 organisations the year before we started in this process. So there aren't the longitudinal pieces of work for us to study. Some service areas where I'd say the individual's productivity has been way off the scale, been fantastic, but they've actually not been doing the job they were necessarily employed to do. Take, for example, our fantastic librarians. They've not been delivering direct library services in the way traditionally we think about them, but they've been supporting either the online offer, moving into now more recently the click and collect offer, but through the pandemic, they were supporting the customer shield and community shield work by supporting the customer call centre. So many people have been really busy doing other things than their day job, so it doesn't help us to give a meaningful metric. But anecdotally, from our social listening, we know that customer satisfaction with the council and the way it's responded has gone up. I've got a few examples where people have asked, as we're starting to come out of this, how long will it take for us to get responses to this? How long will it take to get responses to that? But most people have been mindful of the challenging circumstances we're working in. So, headline answer, I can't give you a direct percentage up or down in terms of the 450 plus service lines the Dorset Council delivers. What I can say is that globally sickness absence is down, and I take that as a positive indicator in terms of the work and productivity that impact that has. I haven't gone into the detail line by line of the 450, but the global figure is that sickness absence is down as an organisation. Pride in the organisation, measured by a survey both before COVID, which we happened to do, and then during, is up by something like around 20-21% points. So actually, we're starting to see increased pride in the activity of the council, and all that contributes, both in terms of the individual's morale and collective morale of the organisation, to, I believe, delivering better productivity, if you want to measure it like that, an outcome. So, Chairman, I'm sorry, you did give me that in advance, and I haven't been able to give you a determined percentage up or down, which may disappoint you, but maybe we can have a conversation about some of the longer term performance metrics, and Councillor Wharf might want to come in and give a response about the new metrics that we've just been started to look at. We've had the first meeting, which is the dashboards of information we're looking at across the organisation in terms of metrics to see how the business is performing. If I stop for long enough, Councillor Wharf might want to come in.
With your permission, Chair, the metrics have been presented to audit and governance, or at least the initial plan for the construction of those metrics. It is still under development, and I don't want to go into any particular detail because we've got some way to go, but it will identify mechanisms for representing the information that you're talking about, and we're going through audit and getting some feedback from them as to how they would like us to continue. And I know Matt Hall who is on the line, was there and sent me a note saying he was quite pleased with what has been specified so far. Thank you.
Excellent. Councillor Sherry Jesperson.
Oh, I'm not sure. Can you hear me? I'm not sure what's happening here. So I'm very glad to hear you mention the metrics, Councillor Wharf, because of course, as we go into the new normal, the whole new different way of working, we will have to measure different things, and that's going to be a challenge for us. And I absolutely appreciate that we haven't got that in place just yet. But I do hope that as we're setting up the new metrics and the way in which we measure our staff's productivity, we will take time to ask the town and parish councils and the other key partners who are users of our services, because they, I know, have a view about how well the council has done, not on the COVID response, which everyone agrees is brilliant, but I know that some of my town and parish councils have a view about how well the council has been doing with some of its other work. And I think we need to hear from them to find out what we can learn from that, to make sure that we deliver as well as we possibly can going forward. Thank you.
Chair, if I may, just to make a response. So Councillor Jesperson is absolutely right. So as I'm sure committee members are aware from other notes that I've given out, John Salgren and I, and latterly Teresa Levy, Executive Director for Children, and also popping in has been Aidan Dunn and his finance team, have been working with the larger town and parish council clerks as a grouping through this. That's been really, really effective, not just during COVID-19, but ongoing, and will continue to ongo. And the topic on our next meeting is actually with the Dorset Association of Town and Parish Councils and their new Chief Executive Neil Wedge, is actually how we engage with the wider remit of the towns and parishes at a clerk level, and that's building on the work that Councillor Tony Alford was already doing before the pandemic hit us, and we had to put a pause on it around engaging with towns and parishes. So points absolutely well taken, Councillor Jesperson, and more than happy to continue with that work, working with our fantastic colleagues across the 163 towns and parishes we have here in Dorset.
And thank you, Matt, and it's great to hear that that pride in the organisation for which people work is up. That's a really positive indicator that, you know, people who are proud of where they work are more likely to enjoy their job and therefore more likely to give 100%, and then, you know, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's really great. In the same way to hear that sickness is also down, but you know, I think it's really going to be key to make sure that wraparound support is there for our staff who may be, as you point out, more easily be able to fall through the support mechanisms that we traditionally had in place. Thank you, Matt. I'm moving on to Spencer for a couple of questions. Spencer, during the last couple of months, Dorset Council has put a lot of time and effort into trying to support particularly the business community as it tries to start back up, because as Councillor Brian Heatley pointed out earlier, the economic impact is going to of the lockdown is still materialising and will have a great effect on the people of Dorset and how they pay the bills. As part of that support, we put in place a fantastic set of free advertising for many of our SME businesses that featured on Wessex FM and the Dorset Echo. My concern is that, like yourself, I represent a ward which is in, you know, the east of the county, that neither of those two establishments cover even Blandford, let alone my ward or in fact yours. And my concern is that there is a little bit of a Dorchester bubble forming in that policy decision, and I was just wondering if that if you had any thoughts on that and how we can try and bring people out to look slightly further afield and recognise that there are distinct communities and media outlets that serve geographically specific points within Dorset.
Thank you very much, Piers, and thanks for giving me notice of your question, because I've done a little bit of research and it's really important that this is explained as thoroughly as I can. We've set up 3 media partnerships which have been arranged by Comms as part of the Shop local campaign and the Reopening High Street Safety Initiative. We got £350,000 funding from the European Regional Development Fund, which was part of a government initiative. Quite a lot of that has been spent on highways dealing with temporary measures to ensure shoppers can safely social distance around the county. But 50,000 of it has been ring fenced for comms in order to support the activity with marketing, encouraging residents to shop local. You rightly highlight the three partnerships: the Dorset to Echo, Wessex FM, and Forest FM. Now, most of you probably won't know Forest FM. There's one or two online that will do, because they're based in Verwood. And they cover Verwood and the surrounding hinterland into Wimborne and so on. So quite an active sort of local community radio station, which we do use quite a lot in getting our message across to the communities. So we've either got it for free, or we've got it heavily discounted, and I think we've also got 222 businesses that have taken up a free listing, of which 39, i.e. 17%, are based in Dorchester. So I wanted to sort of dispel any concerns that it was, as you put it, in the Dorchester bubble. I think it's a bit more than that. I mean, obviously there is an importance around supporting businesses in Dorchester, but it's broader than that. And I think what the work that's been done is around trying to address the concerns across the whole of the geography. And I know we've been working with town and parish councils, and there's many of them, that we've had conversations with and helped us get involved with, dealing with the problems that have been faced by business. And we've got a number of bids around as well, and we've been in dialogue with bids. So a lot of stuff. You've got the Dorchester bid, for example, they are running their own shop local, shop safe, shop Dorchester campaign via the Love Dorchester brand. So there's a lot of work being done by others rather than just relying entirely on Dorset Council. But I was quite encouraged by the vibrancy of the work that we've been doing to try and stimulate support for. We can enable businesses to get back on their feet. And I make particular, if you don't mind indulging me for a moment, comment about the town councils that have been very supportive: Bedminster, Blandford Forum, Bridport, Dorchester, Ferndale, Gillingham, Lyme Regis, Darrell, Minster and Upton, Shaftesbury, Sherborne, Sturminster Newton, Swanage, Verwood, Wareham, Westmoors, Weymouth and Wimborne. So quite a spread of involvement at a local level by our colleagues in the town and parishes, and that's for me a really positive thing. It's how strongly I feel about having a strong relationship with town and parishes. Now we take forward, we got bigger, but we need to stay local, and this is a really good example of that. So I hope that's helped to set your mind at rest that it isn't all in a bubble in Dorchester.
Okay, you referenced in your answer there my last question for everyone's sanity. A lot of the work that have been done around the COVID-19 measures, especially the most visibly in terms of the highways and the edits, I think is probably the best word to use, to the highway layout to facilitate social distancing as businesses reopen. And in business, as you'll know, Spencer, one of the best and most useful things is certainty, to allow businesses to make decisions on their future activities. So this is a lead question. I'll have no shame in admitting it. Can I have your commitment that the measures that we have put in place in Dorset Council to facilitate social distancing, if that be increasing the pavement size in somewhere like Blandford, or putting out seating areas in Sturminster Newton, for example, that those will remain in place until a time in which social distancing is no longer a requirement as laid out by the government?
Good question, Piers, and I'll answer it in both a direct and an indirect way. The one thing we've done as a council is we've abided by the guidance from government, the rules. They say rules, but they're guidance. They're very sound guidance, and they've got that guidance through the various, the health areas of government and so on. And I don't see any reason why this council shouldn't continue to support the community in the way it has, and the businesses in the way we have, in ensuring that people can shop safely and feel confident, as you say, that they can come out, do a bit of shopping and not feel at risk in any way. So we'll do our very best to mitigate any opportunity for people to feel they shouldn't come out and use our high streets. We need people to come back out now, and they are in increasing numbers, come out and help our businesses get back on their feet.
Okay, thank you. What I would like to suggest now is that we pass over to our committee clerk, Helen, for a number of the questions which have been submitted by non-committee members, and a quick abridged synopsis of some of the responses that have been provided by many staff from around the organisation to those questions that were submitted in advance. Helen, I'll pass over to you. Helen?
Sorry, Chairman, I forgot to unmute.
Okay.
The first question is from Councillor David Gray. On housing of the homeless or those needing housing in an emergency, given the 48-hour notice we were given, were the correct processes followed and the members it affected consulted before action was taken? And I believe Rebecca Kirk is going to respond to that question. I know she had another meeting to go to. I thought she was staying with us, but she's not. I will read out the response. In replying to this question, it is important to provide the wider context regarding the housing of rough sleepers and homeless households during the COVID-19 pandemic, as this response will be seen by members of the public who may not be aware of the situation. As Councillor Gray states, on the 26th of March, Dorset Council, along with all other local authorities in England, were emailed by Dame Louise Casey with the heading "Everyone In," asking housing teams to focus on getting every rough sleeper an offer of somewhere they can stay safely by the weekend of the 29th of March. At the same time, the government was advising people to stay at home and told providers of holiday accommodation that they must close. The guidance was later revised in the same week, allowing exceptions for bed and breakfasts, hotels and caravan parks to remain open if they were accommodating key workers or homeless persons. However, by this point, many smaller guest houses and hotels had closed and furloughed their staff. The council approached many businesses in Dorset asking for their support in accommodating rough sleepers, as well as increasing number of homeless persons who, in the main, were in shared accommodation and were being asked to leave their accommodation for a number of reasons. Only a small number of hotels were prepared to support the council in providing accommodation in a very short timescale. In addition, on the 26th of March 2020, Luke Hall MP, Minister for Local Government and Homelessness, wrote to local leaders thanking us for the continuing work in response to the COVID-19 crisis. He emphasised the unprecedented scale of the challenge we all faced and our joint responsibility to safeguard as many homeless people as we can from COVID-19. He wrote that our strategy must be to bring in those on the streets to protect their health and stop wider transmission of COVID-19. Given the tight timescales, the challenges being faced in securing accommodation and the emergency nature of situation, groups of officers were desperately working and calling businesses to obtain accommodation. Given the unique situation the council found itself in and the unprecedented nature of what was being undertaken, there was no official process to follow. The portfolio holder for housing and community safety was briefed of the work taking place. There was simply not enough time to give the emergency nature of the situation. That's the end of the first question.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Howard Legg.
If I could follow up on that one there, accepting that there was not much notice, and I do agree that or understand that one had to act promptly and therefore couldn't go through, if you like, a full exercise. But either at the time or as soon as possible afterwards, was there any form of risk analysis done covering these rough sleepers and homeless people? Because they were taken away from where they might have normally been, where their usual customary way of living, and put somewhere else, which many of them I think appreciated, but nevertheless weren't prepared for the change in life experiences that they were experiencing or having. And because of that, there was a lot of problems in the communities around and about. And this could have been partly because some of these people that are rehoused or homed up had moved maybe 10 or 12 miles from where they normally were, or quite a few of them were put close together when they hadn't been before. And I'm just wondering if there was a sufficient risk analysis done of that and action taken to follow that up, because clearly something went wrong and there was a lot of community unrest in the neighbourhoods of these hotels in the following weeks. Thank you.
Chair, in the absence of Rebecca Kirk, I'm happy to try and give Councillor Legg a global response to the question, which is based on my knowledge from working with Rebecca and briefing local members throughout the position. But ostensibly, I think there's a few things we just need to be very clear about. First of all, we're talking about two different categories of people that we're working with. There are those counted as rough sleepers and those who are counted as homeless, and they are different classifications. On the first category, those rough sleepers. So all of the rough sleepers who we brought in under the Everyone In banner that was stated in the response to the initial question were from the Weymouth area. So none of the rough sleepers were moved 10 or 12 miles, as my understanding of it. But you're absolutely right, Councillor Legg. Each one of those was given a risk assessment. Now, of those rough sleepers, not every rough sleeper did actually take the opportunity to come in. And so we had a number, I think it was around about 11 or 12 people who chose to remain as rough sleepers, and we had outreach workers working with them to check they were safe and check they were okay during the period. They just simply would not, and we had no legal compulsion to bring them in. So all of the rough sleepers were risk assessed in the same way that all of our homelessness cases are risk assessed. I think the challenge was, and you kind of alluded to that in your question, was putting a number of people into close proximity for people who'd not necessarily been used to living in any way but on their own or living on the streets has caused some issues. Issues that none of us would expect it to have created because it was created by a global pandemic. However, the health benefits of bringing those people in off the streets, I think, is far more beneficial. And whilst I accept there's been some real challenges within the community, and again, come back to Aidan's point about a multi-agency response, I really pay great thanks to our multi-agency partners, particularly the police, our community safety team, our housing team, the charities, public health team, and the health workers working with these individuals, where we are now starting to see significant reductions in the activities in the antisocial behaviour. So I accept that it's caused some issues. We did it at pace. We did it at a time when we were all also, as individuals, as officers, all moving to working from home and getting used to that. So it was a really challenging time, and I wouldn't downplay that, but say that absolutely those risk assessments were in place. But risks that you're looking at assessing in normal times necessarily are different to those within a global pandemic, and therefore we created something that perhaps wasn't ever intended or never known to be intended.
Thank you. Helen.
Councillor Gray's second question. On the measures to improve pedestrianisation in the harbour area due to social distancing pressures, did the council consult with all Dorset Weymouth councillors in brackets and the residents it affected in a timely way before implementation? In particular, was the communication plan of the proposed changes signed, agreed beforehand? I believe Councillor Bryan's going to read the response.
Councillor O'Brien.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Discussions were held with Weymouth councillors from Dorset Council who hold seats in the wards in which the Harbourside Vehicle Restriction Scheme is located. A meeting was held at the end of June with councillors John Orrell, Brian Heatley, Claire Sutton, Kate Weller, Ryan Hope and Jill Taylor. Also attending was the Vice Chair of the Harbour Group, Sarah Williams, and myself, which officers outlined the proposal and sought feedback. Several adjustments were made to the proposed scheme as a result of this meeting. Part of the comms strategy and public consultation was to ask people their views via Commonplace, an online consultation platform. Dorset Council launched this on the 4th of June to obtain public views on places where we needed to make the situation safer for cyclists and pedestrians. This method of seeking residents' and businesses' views was heavily publicised on the Dorset Council website, social media and newsletters. In the following 3 weeks, over 2,700 comments were received through this platform about proposals across Dorset. These comments were being analysed regularly to understand Dorset residents' concerns and to inform discussions with members. The website allows users to either register their own comments or support comments already made. Many of the comments received related to the desire to restrict traffic to the Harbourside roads in Weymouth. After aggregating all the various comments with different points, we summarised that of the 105 comments relating to the Harbourside area, 10 were against and 95 were in favour. This was despite many of the concerned businesses and residents already being aware of the potential scheme and several raising it specifically in their comments. Whilst this does not represent a dedicated formal public consultation on the exact details of the scheme, that was impossible within the very tight timescales given to us by government to enable the easing of lockdown safely. The exact details of the schemes were refined using feedback and input from further face-to-face meetings with residents, businesses and councillors throughout the initial phase of the scheme. The legal method used to implement the Harbourside restrictions was to apply an emergency temporary traffic management notice. As the grounds for this were to improve public safety, it did not legally require any prior consultation. However, we thought it prudent to carry out the described level of consultation as an additional measure. We have benchmarked ourselves with other authorities in the South West, a part of the South West Highways Alliance. The feedback we received was that similar authorities were using the same legislation in order to meet the central government's timescale for schemes of this nature. The Harbourside restrictions were communicated to residents and businesses in a number of ways. We issued a press release on the 30th of June, which was picked up by several local media outlets, including the Dorset Echo, Wessex FM and BBC Radio Solent. We also shared details of our social media channels and website, including the story in our e-news to residents, businesses and councillors, and we received over 40,000 recipients. The legal documentation for the restriction was shown on our interactive roadworks map, which is accessible by the public and also used by sat-nav companies for route planning. In addition, we also amended our roadside electronic variable messaging signs to inform people travelling towards the area. Our community highways officers walked the Harbourside during the week before the restrictions came into place and spoke with local businesses, residents and boat owners to explain the plans. This specifically included discussions with a large group of local residents and business owners by the Harbourside on the 1st of July. I'd also like to add that I am still receiving a number of emails on a regular basis with both excellent comments on the way this has been dealt with, and I must place on record my thanks to the officers that have worked so hard and diligently to make this a success. That's the end of the statement.
Thank you. Councillor Brian Heatley, sorry, I should have finished that sentence.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm one of the councillors who was consulted by Ray before this scheme was brought into operation, and I broadly endorse what he says. We agreed it should go ahead. We weren't totally happy with the communications and the consultation, but we were faced with a date and a situation where it was necessary for us to do it. I'd make just one comment. No, I'm going to make two comments. First comment is, on the whole now, it seems to be working reasonably well, and what created a huge amount of fuss has, to a very large extent, died down. I say that knowing I will be told after this meeting this is not the case, but you know what I mean. It was not very clever, though, to use the result of a Dorset-wide survey to say that there had been consultations about it when there were very particular concerns by a reasonably sized group of commercial harbour users themselves. And I think we slightly shot ourselves in the foot doing that. But that is something that happened once again in the rush of difficult circumstances, and I think overall it was handled as well as it could be. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll pass back to Helen to continue with the questions.
The next question is from Councillor Peter Barrow. The government gave Dorset Council 48 hours notice to get our homeless residents into accommodation. Being as Dorset Council has no in-house hostel type accommodation, there was no choice but to rely on the private sector for housing, and this was only forthcoming from 3 hotels in Weymouth. This meant all of our homeless residents were housed in Weymouth, with many being moved away from their home locations and consequently away from existing support networks. What changes in policy and procedures does Dorset Council intend to make to ensure it has a wider range of choices available to house homeless residents in future, so that we do not have a situation where all our homeless residents are housed in one location, with many being moved away from the home locations and existing support networks? The response is, as outlined above in response to Councillor Gray's question, officers were working under extremely challenging circumstances never seen before and had limited options available to them in terms of accommodation. The council works wherever possible to provide accommodation near to support networks, but this isn't always possible. Those without a local connection to Dorset are provided with support to return to their local area. In terms of looking forward, officers have now completed needs assessments of those currently accommodated and have an understanding of the type of accommodation needed for those homeless households currently being supported. This also includes preferred locations which are not all in Weymouth but across the county, taking into account support networks. However, the majority of those supported by the council have a connection to the Weymouth and Portland area. All of this work, along with other information, is being pulled together to create a Dorset accommodation strategy to determine what accommodation the council needs, for example supported housing, hostels, etc., now and in the future. The council has also submitted a bid to MHCLG as part of the Next Steps accommodation programme, which is the government funding announced of £161 million that would be made available in 2020-21 for 3,300 homes for rough sleepers in the next 12 months. There was a further announcement on 24th of June that a fund of £105 million to enable local authorities to best support the nearly 15,000 people placed into emergency accommodation during the COVID-19 pandemic would be available. The council is currently in the process of completing a bid for some of this funding to purchase a site and convert it into a hostel for homeless households, as well as purchase one-bedroom properties. However, this grant funding is not 100%, and there will be an expectation that the council must use some of its own capital to contribute to projects. This will be the subject of a cabinet report in September, which is when we will know if we have been successful, in our bid. That's strange. the end of that response, Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Shall we go on to the next one, as no one's asked to any follow-up questions?
Okay. So first question from Councillor Jill Taylor. I appreciate that hindsight is wonderful, but would like to ask a question about the timeline for housing homeless people in Dorset, in anticipation that improvements can be considered when the planning for future scenarios where homeless people need to or are likely to need bringing in. I would also ask a question about the actions required in the letter to councils on 26th of March, 2 days before lockdown. 1. The World Health Organization declared a global pandemic for COVID on the 11th of March 2020. Countries across Europe were locking down and there were strong indications that the UK would soon follow. Could you please confirm that the need to house homeless people was included in Dorset Council's emergency plans to manage a pandemic? The response is, while a number of business continuity plans had been prepared by the Housing Service to enable the service to be delivered in the event of staff being impacted by a pandemic flu outbreak, the planning did not cover the scenario of increased homelessness. This will now be looked at as part of the wider lessons learned. However, plans also cover the emergency housing of households in rest centres if an evacuation was required, for example, flooding and fire, and discussions took place with emergency planning colleagues what strategies to put in place should this scenario happen, as social distancing in rest centres would have been challenging. Her next question is, outline the actions that were taken between the 11th of March and 26th of March when the instruction came from the MHCLG to take all homeless people in. This is particularly important as this would have been at the time when the NHS were putting their emergency plans into action and block booking hotels for their staff. And there is a detailed response of a list of dates and actions taken, which I will be sending to Councillor Taylor following the meeting, but there are too many to read out, really.
Yes, for members of the public and for members of the committee, it's 3 pages long, and we didn't feel any additional value in Helen having to read those out. So those will be made available to everyone in hard copy form post this meeting.
And they will appear as part of the minutes for the meeting as well when they're published.
Correct.
Councillor Taylor's next question is, confirm that the numbers of homeless people approaching the council for support were in line with the numbers expected, and if not, what future work is being proposed to address this? This is particularly important with the potential for a second wave in winter 2020-2021. The response is, at the height of the restrictions, the council had 156 households in bed and breakfast accommodation, of which 147 were single people. This has decreased as restrictions were lifted, but the number in bed and breakfast accommodation remains high, and as of the 3rd of August, there were 132 households. Despite efforts to move people into other temporary accommodation, there are still households presenting as homeless that the council has a legal duty to support. During the 2-week period 17th to the 28th of August 2020, a further 25 people needed temporary accommodation. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, Dorset Council had a disproportionately high amount of households accommodated in bed and breakfast accommodation due to the lack of suitable temporary accommodation. For the 6-month period August 19 to January 20, the average number of households in bed and breakfast accommodation was 75, and on average 42 households exceeded a 6-week stay. MHCLG have advised the council that Dorset Council is in the list of 20 local authorities outside of London with the highest numbers of placements under the coronavirus response. The scale of the increase was not anticipated. However, as part of the work to develop an accommodation strategy and looking forward, planning is taking place around the numbers of 10 new approaches per week. As outlined above, a bid has been submitted to MHCLG to obtain capital funding to purchase and create additional temporary accommodation spaces, but that is dependent on the council contributing capital funding to the projects. Councillor Taylor's
Councillor Sherry Jesperson.
I'm happy to wait for the till after the 3rd question. Let's.
Okay. Helen.
Okay, so Councillor Taylor's second question. The letter from Luke Hall MP to council leaders on the 26th of March instructing councils to bring people in off the streets included a programme of actions. Action 6 stated, if possible, separating people who have significant drug and alcohol needs from those who do not. What measures were put in place to comply with this, and was this action reviewed during the time homeless people were being housed by us in response to the issues experienced in Weymouth? Response includes a section of the letter from Luke Hall MP, which I won't read out, but then the response goes on to say, due to the tight time frame, all placements were made in a similar way to when the severe weather emergency protocol, when rough sleepers are offered accommodation after 3 days of extreme weather, normally snow, but working in partnership with property colleagues in the property cell to block book accommodation where possible, taking into account the challenges outlined above. The guidance issued by MHCLG for placing rough sleepers was taken down within hours of being issued, with a statement on the government website that more guidance was expected in coming days. This was never reissued. The council was responding to an emergency situation and trying to secure accommodation as quickly as possible. All those placed had an accommodation needs assessment undertaken that asks a series of questions about the individual and their needs to help determine the most suitable placement under the circumstances. Meetings took place with partners such as the police, homeless support, charities, probation services, and reached drug and alcohol within 2 weeks to respond to concerns raised about few of those placed causing antisocial behaviour and how to best support people. All the rough sleepers had a support worker allocated to them, as well as a mobile phone issued to them so they could call for support if they needed it. It is acknowledged that in the early days of the lockdown restrictions, where guidance was extremely strict about contact, it was not possible to provide daily face-to-face contact, but support was given via the telephone. Some health staff were considered to be key workers, but in order to meet their own health and safety guidelines and protect their own workforce, the number of face-to-face contact meetings in the early days was limited. Not all of those supporting the rough sleepers were considered to be key workers. As guidance became clearer, it was possible to increase the level of face-to-face support at the bed and breakfasts from a variety of support agencies. There is now daily support in some of the bed and breakfasts offered to everyone accommodated, not just the rough sleepers. Many councils across the country have experienced very similar issues in securing support. There is a dependence on third parties to provide the right support who also had a duty to protect their staff. End of the second response.
Councillor Sherry Jesperson.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I was just really a comment, really. I really appreciate the detailed questions from fellow councillors on this whole area, but I do think the detailed responses that we're hearing from the housing team, to me they do indicate the care and the absolute attention which the team have approached this extraordinary and unprecedented challenge. And it might be just worth noting for balance, as it were, and remembering that meanwhile, while they were doing all this, the housing team also continued working on the all-important consultation on the new housing allocations policy, which we begun work with them on the housing EAP before lockdown happened, and they carried on with that work through this extraordinary time, and that consultation result is coming to the housing EAP tomorrow and to Cabinet. And I just think what we're hearing today in the level of their responses I just would like to comment that it just indicates to me the extraordinary good work that the housing team have put in at this time and always do. So thank you to them.
I couldn't agree more, Councillor Jesperson. Helen, for the last questions, please.
Okay, so the last questions are from Councillor John Orell. 1. The recent move to incorporate local public health teams more firmly in the track and trace effort is warmly welcomed. One notes the success of such boots on the ground door knocking tactics in Leicester and Blackburn outbreaks. Will our public health team be properly and fully funded by central government as they embark on this vital role? And the response is, the government has announced that NHS Test and Trace will be formally merged with Public Health England to create a new National Health Protection Institute. There are no plans to formally merge local teams with Test and Trace, but we work closely with the Regional Health Protection Team to ensure that we can collectively follow up cases and contacts. If we entered an acute outbreak phase where an on-the-ground presence was required in communities, we can use the Test and Trace grant to support increasing local capacity to follow up and support cases and contacts. But the primary responsibility lies with the Regional Health Protection Teams and will continue to do so. Councillor Earl's second question is, what will be the trigger point for local teams to mobilise? The success of New Zealand going early, going hard tactics. Also, other nations like Scotland or Taiwan aim for eradication rather than control. This is akin to extinguishing a fire rather than letting it smoulder. Might we use our local teams aggressively and actively to aim for 100% impact on each and every case? And the response is, see the previous answer. Evidence from SAGE shows that as long as 85% of cases and contacts are reached and self-isolate successfully, then enough transmission is broken to prevent outbreaks from worsening. Eradication is difficult to achieve when we are now actively importing cases from elsewhere, e.g. from foreign travel and internal travel within England. His third question is, can we use our local flexibility for some testing of asymptomatic individuals on a rolling basis? And the response is, asymptomatic testing is carried out already in our care homes. We would need a clear public health rationale for expanding testing to other groups, because with low numbers of cases, the likelihood of false positives becomes much more of an issue. Current public health advice is to focus testing on people with symptoms and in situations where there is known to have been transmission, e.g. outbreaks. His fourth question is, do our care homes and also care agencies supporting people in their own homes have sufficient PPE? The response is, work is continuing through the PPE cell to ensure that this is the case. Dr. Earl's final question is, social services work in a close relationship to the NHS around discharges. Have our NHS colleagues and CCG Clinical Services Review noted that cutting beds, doctors and nurses to very low numbers by international comparison leaves no slack in the system for epidemics? The NHS was not overwhelmed. However, this was achieved by A, discharging patients to care homes, causing substantial spread to shielded patients, B, stopping routine care, which has also impacted on cancer treatments. A responsive system needs some slack in the good times to deal with demand in the bad times. Thus, care closer to home with hospitals having high bed occupancy rates might seem efficient, but it is not resilient. The response is, I can't speak directly for the NHS colleagues. This response was prepared by Sam Crowe, our Director of Public Health, but he goes on to say, I'm sure everyone concerned with planning and providing NHS services is aware of the difficulty of recovering the health services position caused by the pandemic and the need to work in different ways to continue to accommodate its legacy, not only in terms of beds, but also workforce in the system to continue to provide essential procedures. There is a lot of work currently going on to implement a home first model of care locally that should help with the overall system resilience in future. That's the end of the response.
Thank you, Helen, for that. As I haven't got anyone asking to speak, therefore we can move on to item number 5. But can I thank particularly Spencer and Matt and also Ray Bryan for their time this afternoon. It's been greatly appreciated. You're more than welcome to stay, of course, but if it's okay, I will pass over to John Selgrim and Peter Wharf to introduce and make any additional comments they may wish before the committee members start asking questions.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Over to Peter Wharf.
Thank you, Councillor Peter Wharf. You've got a fairly full report, so I'm just going to go very much in outline. The EAP was set up at the beginning of June, and we have had a series of meetings since then, virtually every 2 weeks. The first meeting concentrated on identifying and agreeing the terms of reference, and we conducted a workshop to identify the terms of reference and also to produce a forward plan that was agreed. So this has been very much a member-led EAP, And then for the last 6 meetings of this particular group, we've had a variety of presentations given by various directors, members, cabinet members and others on the issues they faced. The background to them presenting was, what is it you think we should be learning? What is it we should take forward out of this pandemic if we can take some good news out of it? We have now completed most of the evidence. We've got one meeting on September the 30th, where we're going to get Matt Prosser and a number of others to give us final presentations. I made it clear at the beginning that I viewed this as a task and finish and not an ongoing EAP. At the last EAP meeting, I agreed with all of the members that we would try and make the September the 30th meeting our last, and we will then write a report, which we are in the middle of doing draft already. We will then write a report which I will pass over effectively to one of the 2 new policy committees, and basically I'm going to discuss with the chairs of those 2 policy committees as to which committee this final report should be presented to, or should it be a joint committee. I'm completely happy whichever way it is. My point is that we will have identified a whole number of areas to be explored, and it is my belief, and this is shared by the EAP, that that would be best conducted and taken forward by the policy committee, and it will give them something to get their teeth into, and it will give them something to hit the ground running. And EAPs were only ever meant to be vehicles for getting things going at pace, which is what we're doing here. If I return to the whole background of the meeting, John Selgren at the first meeting spent a little time explaining the relationship between this EAP and the Local Resilience Forum and a number of other organisations that had responsibility for reset in one form or another. And through you, Chair, I'd be very grateful if you'd let John just reprise that quite briefly, because it does help members to understand how this fits in. And the second thing is, which is absolutely completely new information, I've agreed with the leader and the chief exec that we're going to have a peer review light on the EAP, because they've offered it. And that will also, their findings will also be included in the EAP final report. And if I may, could I ask Sarah Longdon, who has been project managing that committee, as it were, to just talk very briefly about the peer review light. So without further ado, if you wouldn't mind, Chair, if you could get John Selgren to briefly describe the LRS and how that fits in with what we're doing, and Sarah Longdon to describe in a little bit of detail the peer review light. And can I just say thank you to both of them, because they have worked absolutely like Trojans, if I can say so, in managing to get a huge amount done in a relatively short space of time. And obviously after we've done all that, I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. John Selgren.
Thank you, Chairman. Very quick reprise then of the recovery process. So the recovery process is run effectively as part of the arrangements that fall under the Civil Contingencies Act. And as there are to the response stage, that's where we actually seek to respond to the event itself. There is Cabinet Office guidance concerning the recovery process. So we look to national guidance and set what we do locally within that context. As Aidan described earlier, we work on a multi-agency basis in this situation and work across Pan Dorset, which includes our colleagues in the BCP area as well. So the LRF also has a recovery group, and I was asked to chair that group on behalf of the partners. We then produced a Pan Dorset recovery from COVID-19 and produced a plan that was agreed and signed off by all of the partners. Beyond that, then, each of the individual partner organisations will produce in their own individual organisational recovery plans within that broader LRF framework. So as Councillor Wharf has described, what we did in Dorset Council was to develop our own recovery plan within the context of the national guidance of the Pan Dorset LRF work, and then particularly looking to the guidance we've had from officers and members within our own organisations on the priorities for recovery.
Thank you very much. Sarah Longdon, would you like to add?
Hello, everybody. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Councillor Wharf. So the LGA, Local Government Association, has offered up this member and officer panel to do a peer review, but on a sort of scaled back process this time, given the nature of what it's looking at. So they are going to hold a 2 to 3 hour virtual session with a small number of the leader, the deputy leader, chief executive, and John, executive director for Place, to have a look at our recovery work and the work of the EAP and the emerging plan for recovery and reset, and to provide some early challenge, some scrutiny of that, and some ideas as well to help get that sort of perspective and view, an external view. And what we're wanting to do is tie that in with the peer review that we had about a year ago, looking at the early days of Dorset Council and its emerging council priorities. So we're just organising this at the moment. It'll take place in early September, and the first and foremost in this review will be the report and the work and outputs of the panel, the executive advisory panel.
Thank you very much. As with the last item, I think we'll go around the committee members in the order I have them on my list. So to the Vice Chairman first, Councillor Mike Parks.
Thank you, Chairman. I've just got one thing I'd like to raise, which is on page 72 relating to the EAP held on the 24th of June. The first item on there related to planning and the framework, and it states to make it more flexible and rapid to support businesses more quickly. It concerns me that we still have considerable backlogs in our planning process. I can give an example for certainly a business in my ward that put in a change of use for a shop back in March, and as of today there still hasn't been resolved. Something that's quite quick and easy to do when we should be supporting businesses, getting them back up and running out of lockdown. It really concerns me that we're not seeing any progress sort of 2 months down the line after it was discussed at the EAP, and certainly there's a business been waiting 5 months for a change of use on a shop in a high street that is generally struggling. Thank you.
Chairman, can I pick that one up? So it obviously wouldn't be appropriate in this meeting to comment on a particular individual case. But the reality on the planning service is that the backlog has been cleared, and in fact the team have made very, very good progress on the backlog of applications in the process. I haven't got the figures in front of me this afternoon, Chairman, but I can happily perhaps provide some headline figures on the performance of the planning service that I think will respond to Councillor Park's question.
Yes, if you could, I'm sure that would be greatly appreciated by Councillor Parks and the rest of the committee. Mike, any other questions you had?
No, that was it for me. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, we'll next go to Councillor Beryl Ezard. Beryl, are you there?
Sorry, I was on the phone. No, I've got no questions. Thank you very much, Peter, for the report, and I'm really following it quite closely. But at this moment, I haven't got any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Then we'll go to Councillor Barry Gorringe. Barry.
Thank you, Chairman. No, I don't have any questions at this time. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Brian Heatley has indicated that he doesn't have any questions, so therefore we will move on to Councillor Sherry Jesperson.
No questions from me, Chair, at this point. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Howard Legg.
Nothing, I'm afraid. Sorry, I should have told you beforehand.
No worries. Councillor Julie Robinson.
Oh, she's not here.
Has she managed to join us? No,
I don't.
looks like. Sorry,
I don't believe so. I don't believe so,
okay.
Chairman.
Okay, down to Councillor David Shortall.
Thank you, Chairman. I've got nothing to ask. Very comprehensive report, may I say.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Matt Hall.
No questions, Chairman.
Okay. Councillor Jill Haynes. Again, I believe it looks fit. Councillor Jill Haynes' internet has dropped off. Councillor Jane Somper.
No questions, thank you, Chairman.
Okay, and Darryl has indicated that he doesn't have any questions either. I just have one question for Peter. In terms of the methodology, I just wanted to be assured that we are going to take a really quite analytical and data-led approach to decision making. My concern comes that, and very rightly so, during a time of an emergency, people have been incredibly overwhelmingly positive, sometimes in cases that don't necessarily warrant it, but making sure that we are positive to keep morale high both within our communities and our organisation to drive our objectives forward is important. I just wanted to make sure that we're going to use a really fine-tooth comb and quite, as I said, analytical view on making decisions on what has worked well and what things possibly haven't worked as well. I'd just like to hear your thoughts on where that balance sits and your attitude towards that.
Thank you, Chair. My attitude is absolutely right. We must do things based on evidence, which is why I earlier talked about the issue about people moving back into offices. We need to get all of the detail. The report, bear in mind, because it has been largely gathering people's thoughts, the report will be presented to the appropriate policy committee, and I will be looking for them to start to build on. I will try and give them as much evidence as possible, but in terms of recommendations, I will give them, on behalf of the committee, because this is very much a committee report, we will give them areas that we think need to be fully looked at. We will attempt where we can to describe further evidence that should be gained, but at the end of the day, I would see them taking that report and actually making the decisions based on evidence that they will need to gather and establish for themselves. And can I just do sort of two slight plugs? One is the EAP has been a bit unusual in that I very publicly said that anybody was welcome to attend, and we have had a number of additional attendees. And whilst they didn't contribute in terms of contributions, the numbers that I've had have all responded on the chat line, and I ensured their questions were answered. One of the things we did was we asked all members and all people who attended to give us their top 5 issues that they think we should address. And that was just after we'd heard everything. I've now had that from many people, committee members and observers. And if other people want to do the same and respond to me on that, they're welcome to do so, because I'm very happy to take any input from anybody. But to just summarise, I see the policy committee taking the report and doing further evidence gathering in order to arrive at recommendations that they will then make through to Cabinet to the whole Council. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any further questions. No one is indicating that they wish to ask any. So thank you for waiting so long to come and talk to us, but it's greatly appreciated. And therefore, I'll move on to agenda's item 7, which is urgent items. We don't have any, and exempt items, again, we don't have any, which therefore brings us to the conclusion of our meeting. I just want to bring to the committee's attention, obviously this is our last meeting before the annual meeting, and therefore the last meeting of this committee in its current form. I will be sitting down with the chairman, who will be taking over the remit for this committee in the new structure post September and presenting to him our forward plan and answering any questions and assisting in that transition as much as I can. But from me, can I just thank you for your hard work and effort over the last 18 months. We couldn't have done it without any of you, so everyone's contribution has been fantastic, and I look forward to continuing to work with you in whatever guise that ends up being.